if we just focus on what people do best and what people enjoy and not limit hiring, we will end up with organizations where we don't have to argue, okay, everybody hates doing X. We need to force someone to do X, whatever it is, filing or organizing events. You need to hire people that are representative of neurodiversity and different talents, just like, the world needs biodiversity. So hire people from a full range of human population, because then you won't have to force someone into something that's not intrinsically motivating and they hate it.
Welcome to This Anthro Life, Ludmila. I'm really excited to talk with you. That there's a lot of really interesting conversations happening today around the workplace, around workplace diversity, around neurodiversity. And what's interesting is that as much as we've seen a lot of these conversations progress and move in directions, like we're still kind of scratching the surface, it seems, as a society, kind of by and large. And so I was excited to talk with you today. Came across your new book, The Canary Code, that just came out, which I'm excited about. I thought it was a really interesting and fun read, and important, I think, to kind of give both like practical tools for leaders to be able to implement in their organizations, but then also thinking and asking kind of important and deeper questions around the culture and the societal implications of what neurodiversity is and like why we haven't defined it before and what it might mean. So just want to, open up by saying great to have you on the program and excited to chat with you today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
So to open us up, then thinking about this, I think you have this provocative title that there's this idea of the Canary Code as this issue, right? And I'd love it, to kind of give us some context for folks as we're kind of entering into this conversation around neurodiversity in the workplace. What is the Canary Code? Like, why is that a framing that you use to kind of set up this type of work?
Sure. Well, if you think about the expression "canary in the coal mine," it does refer to actual canaries. It's not a myth or imagination. There were actual canaries in coal mines, and in the UK they were used through 1980s until they were replaced by carbon monoxide detectors. So canaries process oxygen and air more intensely by design. That allows them to fly. And that also means they are more sensitive to toxins. So when canaries would start feeling not great, then everybody would evacuate. Canaries would be given oxygen. They actually had those mini oxygen tanks for canaries. And if the air was good enough for canaries, it was good for everyone. So that's my idea and application to the workplace. If you think about neurodivergent people, what we know about specifically autistic people from research is that our brains process about 40% more information, at least at adolescent age. Our brains naturally process more information, which is why sometimes you say, well, you're more sensitive to something. Yes, you're going to be more sensitive to something because your brain metabolizes information and environment more intensely. So you pick up on patterns. You also pick up on stressors earlier than other people. So someone might experience mild annoyance from the noise. An autistic person is going to really experience physical pain. But eventually, everyone is going to have cardiovascular and other effects from constant noise, because we know that it damages people whether they report conscious annoyance or not over time. But autistic people will report that it's a problem before everyone else. And the same thing with more of the psychological level toxicity, workplace bullying, the lack of transparency. Neurodivergent people tend to be hit first by that sort of toxic environment. But over time, it is going to harm everyone. So we create workplace environments that work for neurodivergent people or multiply marginalized people who have fewer resources to deal with all those problems. We are going to create environments that will also allow to cut down on stress and the loss of productivity for everyone.
No, that's fascinating. And I think it's a great metaphor. Thanks for walking us through that, because there's this idea that, if my brain is processing more information or emotions or things coming at me in different ways than kind of a quote unquote neurotypical brain, right? I'm putting in air quotes if you're listening to this. This idea that we're going to then get people responding in ways that would be either like before, and this, I'm kind of thinking about this too in terms of a neurotypical brain is actually then they're being slower, right? They're actually slower in terms of catching the different kinds of, if there's workplace bullying or different environmental challenges, that they may not get quite as quickly as a neurodiverse brain. And so as you think about this too, I know you've done a lot of really, really interesting and I think important work around in consulting for workplaces as well as teaching, in industrial organizational psychology at Vanguard University in trying to get a sense here in terms of as you're approaching the workplace itself, why did that area become important as an area to think about neurodiversity for you? Like what was it about the workplace that caught your attention as something that we need to be thinking about and ultimately improve?
So I've been focused on my workplace in some shape or form my entire career. But when I discovered specific statistics for unemployment and underemployment, which is about 80 to even 85% by some reports for autistic college graduates, that's shocking. Wow. And then for all neurodivergent people, about 30 to 40%. So I just felt like this is something that needs to be solved as an emergency problem because so many people suffer and they're talented, capable people who can do incredible work. In fact, when autistic people are appropriately matched to jobs, they outperform neurotypical person, according to JP Morgan, by 140%. But even if they don't, it's still like leaving people out of jobs and without ability to contribute. It's tremendous grief for people, and there's also huge suicide rates, much higher suicide rates in autistic communities and neurodivergent communities because of all those obstacles. So there's a tremendous human reason to solve this problem. And yes, there's a business reason too, but to me, it's mostly the human reason, but I understand that other people also approach it from the business perspective and tremendous talent loss that also occurs when so many people can't use their talents. So I just really wanted to address this issue, but I've spent decades solving various workplace problems and inclusion problems. So this was really the last piece in this lifelong quest for addressing workplace inclusion intersectionally.
I think it's interesting too, because the workplace is a literal place, or or just how most adults spend their adult lives, right? They spend a lot of their time in the workplace or around the workplace or working in a professional setting. And so I agree with you that there's a tremendous both human opportunity and cost if we don't think about questions of inclusion and inclusivity. And it's interesting to when we talk about this too, like bringing that into the conversations, how they have taken place in the U.S. Like there's been the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion as executive members on teams, and also we see initiatives and happening in organizations themselves. And you've kind of approached these questions, I think, in a lot of really interesting ways too, of like how we've seen some of those shifts. But what's something that I want to like both detour, but then path us forward into is that a lot of your other previous work in terms of thinking about workplaces, you did some really interesting work on kind of intercultural relations and intercultural relation programming. And something that just caught my attention, this may be just my bias as an anthropologist, right? But of course, like thinking about this idea of the kind of cultural differences that we might see in terms of like, how do we work on intercultural relations and how that relates to thinking about things like neurodiversity, right? And so I often like to take a comparative approach, which is why I thought this is a cool pathway to think about with you, is this idea of like, so I'm curious about that also work, thinking about, how does intercultural thinking inspire basically a new way of approaching, I think, the idea of neurodiversity in the workplace?
It's very rare that people connect cultural level, global cultures, or even organizational cultures, so more on that level, to neuroinclusion, you just kind of assume, okay, so give me the list of accommodations. Very often people tell me, okay, just give me the list of things to do with by people, and that's it. Well, that is not that simple. Within your organizational culture, we need to adjust. And obviously, globally, not all the processes are translatable. So there is a tremendous disconnect in general when people think about diversity. Very rarely we think about it intersectionally, and intersectionally to the point where we consider national level cultures, subcultures within those, immigration, class migration, and neurodivergence at the same time. And there is definitely a lot to consider because we are not one thing. So when we consider neurodivergence, for example, we know that women have traditionally been underdiagnosed. And that is true about a variety of neurodivergent conditions, autism and ADHD, and girls are missed. So that's one thing. People from lower socioeconomic classes are typically missed. And until the last year in the U.S., there was a huge disparity that finally seems to be closing between white children diagnosis and Black and brown children. So there are all those issues. And then when it comes to the workplace, obviously, national cultures impact organizational cultures in various ways. And then when you start thinking about including people based on their psychological differences within different cultural settings, it is going to take somewhat of a different form. And on the other hand, people do not often talk about cultural manifestations on the psychological level, because very often people think about culture, they talk about it in political terms or in larger sociological terms, but culture is also reflected on the level of our emotional functioning, our automatic reactions. So that's where culture also bridges neurodiversity and neuroinclusion. So there are many areas on those lines that are underexplored, and that's really where inclusion happens or doesn't happen. Because if you don't consider those intersectionalities, people are going to fall through the cracks, and no kind of inclusion is going to happen if you just think about a person as one thing, a person from culture X, or a female, or a Hispanic person, or Asian person. Okay, but what are the other things about them? Not just one thing can describe us. And the same thing, nobody's just an autistic person or a dyslexic person. There are many different factors that come into it. So you can't just export neuroinclusion practices without adaptation. And you also cannot lead neuroinclusively, I talk a little bit about in my book, without being a culturally aware leader. And things like cultural humility, that works for expats, which is my first job when I was, 19 years old, working with expats. And then when you're working with neurodivergent people, there is neurodivergent culture. There is very distinctive autistic culture. So you need the same kinds of skills, such as cultural humility, in order to work with culture on that level as well. So there's a lot. I can talk about it. Like there's a separate book on culture and neurodiversity, I think.
It's an interesting point, and I appreciate the what you just raised there too, in terms of that when we're often thinking about inclusion and well-being in the workplace, that we don't often see sort of the kind of nuances required for thinking about psychology, right? Like it's interesting that we've seen Gen Z really raise kind of a broader societal level question about mental health, as a practice that we have a right to, as humans, but also like we need to pay more attention to, but in the workplace, but also, in everywhere else that we spend our times in schools and a good reflection on the rate of burnout and job satisfaction or dissatisfaction, gender inequality. And like this interesting kind of point of that you raised too, that we have to approach even someone's psychology, right, from a level of both cultural humility and awareness of diversity, right? Again, and it's not never just one thing that describes a person. And that's a great point where it's, you know, we can tend to kind of unintentionally lump people in as like, oh, okay, well, you have ADHD, okay, then that like describes enough about you that I don't need to know that much more, right? Or like I have to cater to just that one thing as a business leader, and like that's, you know, think about yourself. If you are a business leader, you know, watching or listening right now, it's like, you know, you yourself are a maybe a spouse, maybe a sibling, maybe a child, maybe a parent, you know, a friend, you know, a neighbor. Like there's all these different kind of roles that we have. You know, you might be a fan of horror movies or adventure TV shows or romance novels. I don't know, right? So it's just like all these things that like would categorize or like tell you more about who you actually are as a person, that we can't sort of like, you know, draw a flat line of like, okay, well, certain people are just like this, right? And recognizing that happens psychologically, like we have to think about that psychologically too, I think is a really important point. It reminded me, there's one thing, just is like a fun fact that I thought was really cool that you talked about in your book too, is like, even as we think about how we approach these terms, these ideas, autism, ADHD, you know, they come, you know, typically from a medical kind of way of thinking. There's some DSM, diagnostic statistical manual that we see from, you know, looking at psychological, mental states. And one thing you had pointed out was that in New Zealand, working with Maori communities, that they had worked on it's kind of like transliterating those ideas, right? So not just saying that like we're taking a Western biomedical definition of autism or ADHD and then saying it means this thing, right? But if I'm getting these right, it's like autism translates to this idea basically of like, it's like his her own time and space kind of idea, and ADHD is kind of points us towards this idea of like attention goes to many things. I'm sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce Maori. I'm not, I don't know if I could do that very well, but these both interesting ideas of like, what this could be. When you were thinking about exploring the idea of neurodiversity in workplace, like how did you come across, or like what inspired you to think about that too? Like, you know, we're kind of looking at how is this being explored? How is neurodiversity being explored across the world in different cultures? I'm just kind of curious, like how, like on one hand, if we can help leaders kind of get out of their own bubble, right? In terms of like, I'm looking at my one group and recognizing one, that we have to treat psychological difference as a reality, right? And then on top of that, like what can we learn from other cultural groups, right? As we kind of look outside of ourselves and say, oh, there's actually like, if we think about what ADHD or autism even means in Maori, it changes a little bit, I think, how we can think about what these concepts, what these ideas are. So I'm just curious your thought process on this. And in the kind of, do you bring these sort of, I don't know, factoids or like other kind of nuggets of wisdom from other cultural groups kind of into conversations when you're doing kind of consulting work or working with leaders to kind of open their thinking process?
I really love those terms when they try to adjust understanding that it's not a bad thing. So ADHD, okay, attention hyperactivity deficit disorder, that can sound really ominous. But if you think about attention goes to many things, when you are in a job that requires that attention goes to many things, you are at advantage. It's a good thing. And the same thing, ability to hyperfocus or other neurodivergent differences, they could be very positive things. But when we're thinking about the medical labels, autism spectrum disorders or dyslexia, they do not point to a positive that can also come with those differences. And it's a very thin line, because obviously some people experience more of a struggle than others with those conditions. And it also could be impacted by various intersectionalities. So for example, if you're autistic and have enough means to have privacy and be protected from noise, you might actually experience a lot more autistic advantage that people talk about. If you're poor and you're constantly bombarded by noise, and a child growing up poor doesn't have their own room, you are going to experience a lot more suffering. But is the suffering come from poverty, autism, or interaction of those? So in this case, it's the interaction of those. So even whether something is a disability or a superpower is dependent on the context. And then how do you label it? And how do you say that something is good or bad? So hyperfocus is one characteristic that sometimes people say it's a bad thing. We need to beat it out of autistic people. We'll need to have special programs to make them more interruptible, and so that they don't like get into something. Well, when you get into something, you get so creative, you produce so much work that neurotypical people pay hyperfocus gurus to help them get that. But why would you want to beat it out of neurodivergent people whose brains are wired to do that? It doesn't make sense. The way we frame things, the same characteristic could be framed positively when someone wants it for themselves as a neurotypical person, but as a bad thing when it's something that naturally occurs in neurodivergent populations. And the language can be very stigmatizing. The same thing could be considered as, hyperfocus or hyperfixation as a negative thing in a sentence about neurodivergent people, and as a positive thing in a sentence about some leader who wants to, get more done in a day. So it's very interesting how we use language. And sometimes we use terms, specifically with autism, but with ADHD and other terms as well. For decades, they've been portrayed in a society in such a way that many people just have this horrified reaction on the gut level. But what a terrible thing can it be, because for a long time, all you would know about it is the images of, desperate parents who are trying to do something about their child because the child is in a very, very severely negatively impacted state. And that doesn't mean it never happens. So we're not going to say that it never happens, but that society over-indexes on that. And when someone who is successful in their career, who has some issues, but they're not particularly visible, and then this person discloses that they are autistic at work, what very often happens that people either don't believe you, or they say, okay, this person is autistic, their career is over, they will never get promoted, they get treated like an 8-year-old, and just because of the terms, that people don't realize just how significant difference are within the group. And people either just apply this one label or the other label. And they say, well, then autism doesn't exist, or those people are faking and seeking attention, because how hard can it be? Look at how successful they are. And they point like someone like, Elon Musk. And on the other hand, they'll say autistic people are completely incapable, and there's no way we're going to ever hire them, because what in the world can they possibly accomplish? So there's just, the language has shaped society to think about it in very polarizing ways. And so I wish we could replace those terms. Another thing that happens, that even someone who, has a PhD in psychology, and there are many people who have PhD in psychology or related disciplines, and we don't even realize until much later in life that what we've been taught doesn't necessarily match all manifestations of neurodivergence. And people start realizing much later, after really successful careers, that, what, my differences actually do meet those criteria, but because we are mostly shown, 4-year-old boys obsessed with trains, not 30-year-old women who are successful but are struggling with, let's say, sensory issues in the workplace, or with being forced into being more social than what was called by their initial job description. Or, as I said, it happens to many people. Someone has been extremely successful, and they get moved into an open office, and suddenly they can't do their job that they've been doing for years. So when we encounter things like that, we start thinking, and we're like, no, we're not being difficult. We're not being high maintenance. Our brains literally shut down and scream and suffer when you put us into that environment. Then people end up being diagnosed, and it can come as quite a shock if we only encounter those very stereotypical portrayals of neurodivergence in the video, like little boy who is not talking and focusing on trains, or another little boy who is bouncing off the walls. And those are by far not the even main representations of autistic and ADHD traits, and they can manifest in many, many different ways. It can be a very, very dreamy, quiet girl, but the girl would have ADHD and it just doesn't present in a stereotypical way. So there's a lot. Those medical terms have been definitely an advancement from, saying that someone is a witch, but they also have done a lot of disservice to those communities that get labeled and relabeled and struggle to find their place between extreme negative stereotypes or superpower stereotypes, that every autistic person is a genius, which isn't true either. So people really struggle to find the place where, I'm just an everyday human that is good at some things and not really good at other things. So how do I persuade society that I actually exist? And how do I get people to believe that, yes, it's possible for me to be professionally successful and autistic, and no, I don't need to be treated like an 8-year-old.
You said so many important things there. And then, I mean, to share a bit of me here too. It's that I was diagnosed with adult ADHD a few years ago, and it was something that I hadn't really thought about. But it's like I recognized I began struggling with focusing in school as an adult, and that was interesting because that was confusing to then think about how could this turn on later, right? They always kids tend to get it. So even to this point, I had an incorrect assumption also of how these can present, and and then it also took a long time in terms of the home piece too, right? To find out what it means to have feel like you're at home and you can kind of be yourself, as it were. Learning how to define oneself in categories that are related to things like neurodiversity or ADHD or things like that, and then also, do we provide the environment or the societal space for it? So I think that's, this is actually really helpful. Thanks for the therapy, but no, just this notion of how we can kind of think through these approaches, because
I'm not licensed to do therapy, but
right. But this, with that too, this idea here that a lot of it also is environmental in terms of how do we set up the environment for people to be successful, right? Or to include them, right? And so I don't mean environmental in terms of it's going to cause something, but just it can cause triggers or make things better or worse, right? And that's an important thing to recognize, that even as we think about just definitions from urban planning around disability, right? A lot of that, again, these social models of disability, right, really matter, because it's not so much about I am disabled, but it's that there are no, if I'm in a wheelchair, I can't walk well, but it's that sidewalks either don't exist or that I can't get past them because there's a curb that just drops off versus goes in a ramp, for example. And I think this is there's been some really important, I think, movements also to this. And I know you talk about this as well, as we kind of recognize that there's an interplay between self and the world out there, right? And how do we interface between those two? And neurodiversity and neurodiverse people we have to do a lot of work now to kind of help shift those conversations, to get people to recognize that it isn't just these, as you said, two super polarized examples, right? Of a little boy bouncing off the walls or a little girl not speaking, or just someone that can't function as an adult or couldn't be successful for some reason. And so it's I think why this is the kind of work that you're doing is so important as part of that. And so I'm curious as I think about this in terms of, because a lot of your work is framed around how do we make design healthier environments, right, in the workplace. So both it's the mindsets of leaders and colleagues and the actual environment itself too. And you mentioned open office plans as an example there, right? So I'm curious how you kind of approach this, right? And open office plans are a great example because a lot of people just don't like them anyway, right? But I can say they can present the specific problems for if you have a sensory difference in terms of how you perceive different senses, let alone intersectionality, right? That a lot of women originally, when they first started doing them, reported feeling less safe in those environments because there's less privacy. It's that like, and there's things like this too that like make a difference in terms of like how one is in the world. So let's talk about that. Like, how do we think about this relationship between like designing a space and environment in the workplace and like what leaders and people might bring to it in terms of like organizational culture? Like, how do we balance those two in terms of making a place, designing a place, an environment that's more inclusive, with people that either might be resistant or don't understand, right? That how they're acting, treating, and building a space will shape people's experiences for better, for worse.
Right. And it could be physical space and it could be psychological space. And culture is obviously so interesting because sometimes leaders say, I can create culture, and they think they can do it by pronouncement. Or they say HR does culture and I have nothing to do with it. And obviously neither one is true. Because culture, no, you cannot create culture by pronouncement. You can influence culture by creating scaffolding and procedures and by being an example. But there are also often very unintended consequences. So, for example, if you set out to create a culture of transparency, you can say we're going to be transparent. You can create procedures where the workflow is visible, where all the minutes are published, and you can definitely consistently be an example. You can also just not set any kind of plan for creating a culture, but by not being transparent, you'll probably create a culture of fear and gossip without ever intending to do it. So cultures are very interesting. They are co-created. And physical spaces influence that as well. And open offices is actually a good example of trying to influence culture gone wrong, because the idea was we'll create spaces that are more collaborative. And as you mentioned, women especially felt very unsafe and exposed to gaze. And then many people feel uncomfortable. And in general, research shows that collaboration goes down in open offices. People start emailing each other from the same room because there's too much, and they're actually trying to reduce their overstimulation. And but there is this still belief somehow, despite all the research that shows all the drawbacks and it doesn't work, that somehow open office plans improve communication, which they don't, or collaboration. There are much better ways to improve communication and collaboration without stressing people out. We can do a virtual brainstorming. Brainwriting is a lot better for actually getting everyone to contribute to ideation rather than two extroverts in the group. And so even that desired outcome that people have tried to accomplish through a particular physical environment can actually be accomplished a lot better if you create in physical environment quiet places and collaborative places and give people ability to get away and think for themselves as well as collaborate. And you can also create incredible virtual spaces. You don't have to be in the same place, or you can be in a space, once a month, and then you can work on your own and you get very good collaboration results. So people underestimate just how complex cultures are and how complex those variables are, like collaboration. And we can design cultures, but we can't do it in a simplistic way that people sometimes come up with, that cure-all that's supposed to work everywhere from London to Singapore, except it doesn't work anywhere from London to Singapore. And you also sometimes just don't understand unintended consequences. So very often cultural design and any kind of design attempts in the workplace fail because they don't consider unintended consequences. So it's not as simple as someone coming up with pronouncement. You have to be very consistent. You have to lead by example. You can reshape cultural norms, but it's a little bit more than just one person saying, okay, from now on, everyone is going to do something in XYZ way.
We do often see these kind of notions that culture is either something that HR does. They do the people thing, right? And or it's just like, or like we have a culture. Like I've heard more than one CEO. I'm sure you've heard even more than just saying we have a culture of excellence. And you're like, what does that even mean, right? And even like, you know, not to knock the sentence itself, but I think like we have a culture of is interesting versus like we are co-creating a culture of, right? Even like how we approach what it is that we do. It's like we have the box. It's over here on the shelf. That's the culture box, and it's excellent. You know, it's of excellence. I think it's this really interesting idea that it's like, you know, even if there's an understanding that it is to be made, right, or it's like that we are going to work on together on it. There kind of oftentimes I think is there, or I see like there's this willful blindness to there's also still a hierarchy in the organization, right? And that leaders will lead and managers will manage and like employees will employ, or like often after lead. And like, I mean, like I forget the percentage, but like, you know, the highest percentage of reasons that people leave organizations is because they have bad managers, right? They like usually, which means they have zero empathy for their employees, right? And don't consider their individuality as part of that. And, you know, that should tell us something also in terms of why that's the main, like a primary reason that we see people leave. And like somebody may not say I'm leaving because I have ADHD or I have autism or something, right? But you know, you may hear other things like I either felt threatened or didn't like my boss, or they micromanaged me or whatever it is. Like that can then, of course, I think intersect in many ways that like also get ignored. You know, even when you think about why people leave, like if they provide an exit interview, right, or a bad review on Glassdoor.com, like you typically don't get even that full story. You know, so it's like. I think just highlighting why it's difficult to kind of grasp that the actual like impact, you know, of how we and why we need to think about neurodiversity as a key part of like creating innovative and helpful spaces, you know. Something I wanted to ask you about too is this idea of like that you're kind of talking about this in terms of virtual collaborative spaces. Like how do you kind of think about or coach leaders on the connection between neurodiversity and like creating innovation?
Well, first of all, you need to make organizations more neurodiverse, because when you exclude neurodivergent people, let's say through your hiring process that's not neuro-inclusive, you are going to limit the pool of innovation, because a lot of innovation does come from the people who are a little bit further away from the center of the average. So first of all, don't exclude those people during the hiring process. And then create environments where there's enough psychological safety and encouragement to think independently, so that people would actually contribute. Because in many of our organizations, you are hired to be creative, but then you get a hidden message because, you know, layers of culture, that you're not allowed to be smarter than your boss. I come from a culture where I actually got told that point blank. But many people still get it that doing your best is actually not safe, because your boss actually is going to be upset with you, and your coworkers are going to bully you if you're considered overachiever. So again, there's explicit message of the culture, be creative and be innovative, but then there's an implicit message of just, you know, be maybe average or slightly better than the average, but don't be too good, because then you'll get bullied. And neurodivergent people are notoriously bad at getting those hidden messages. So we just go all out, and we just go all the way in being our best, creative, most productive self. And then we get punished for that, because we didn't get the hidden message that actually when they say they want you to be innovative and productive, they actually did mean all the way. So there is a way to create culture that truly and honestly rewards innovation, and where people are not threatened by each other, but they are supportive and reward each other for being their best. And sometimes people create unhealthy competition in the organization, and then people put more effort into undermining each other rather than in being their best. So there are many variables, which is why I talk about looking at outcomes, transparency, a valid measurement of someone's performance, where people are not giving lip service to performance, but actually punishing and rewarding people based on water cooler conversations. So there's a lot that goes into creative cultures that are innovative, but detoxifying organizations, removing all those threats of bullying, which high performance often face, and allowing people to work with their schedules, work in ways that facilitate their best performance, giving a goal that's tied to a particular output, but not how you do it, or whether or not you spend a certain amount of time in your seat or with a mouse jiggler. Those are things that really support innovation. And so not being afraid to hire the best people and defining the best as the best for the job with the best skills, rather than, who you want to be in the airport with, because that doesn't usually work. And then really allowing people to work with their strengths, matching what people do with their strengths, because very often we also end up with super generic job descriptions. So we want someone to do innovative jobs and answer the phone or something else. And that doesn't make sense, because we take away from people's ability to work with their strengths. And many people report they never in a given week work with their best strength. So you also want to place people into proper positions where they can do what their brain wiring is particularly aligned with. And with neurodivergent people who tend to have areas of strengths and areas of struggle that have more of a difference than the typical person, it's particularly important, but it's generally also very important to objectively evaluate talent. Not an assumption. I'm not talking about, strengths that are just kind of assumed, self-reported strengths. I believe I'm good at leadership or whatever. But objectively measured, assessed talents and motivation that then are matched to particular goals and work tasks that allow the person to bring in the fullness of their intrinsic motivation, because that is what is really going to free the creative potential and not squashing it, because many organizations actually beat out our intrinsic motivation out of us rather than support it.
It seems like that tends to happen where it's kind of the creativity gets pushed out, in part, right, because of, I want to say leader incompetence, but it's like leader ego, right? Oftentimes, which could be incompetence, I guess, but just like, on the one hand, that they don't want you to be smarter than they are. But then this other side too, that there's expectations that, that interestingly, and I think it's like, thankfully we're seeing sound a bit more and more archaic. Like the pandemic changed people's perceptions of like, can I work remotely? Do I have to be in an office versus being able to work virtually? We're seeing multiple countries around the world experimenting with 4-day work weeks, for example. We see, in the US is doing it. We see some companies doing that. They're trying it too, so the question of like scheduling, but to your point too, like, can some people work in the evening time versus daytime, or, if their brain is just more on at night. And so they're thinking about this, like, to your point, these ideas of like an outcomes-based approach. I think it's really interesting too, because like, I totally, I resonates what you're saying there in terms of that we've seen just a massive increase in terms of like generic job descriptions that we're asking people to do. Like, that they're getting like, I want you to be a Python and JavaScript developer, but also be a full stack developer that can do front end and back end. And I need you to answer the phones, talk to clients, and like do the support tickets. Oh, and also work on our website branding, and it's like, wait, like those all sound interesting on the one hand, but at the same time, like, I would become super ineffective if I had to do all of those. Around all the time. I mean,
it's not designed for a human,
right? And that's an interesting thing to, as we think about, like, so I guess like, how do we think about that? And or like, how have you kind of approached this question when we're working with organizations to say, let's think more specifically about how we're designing the roles themselves, right? I think outcomes-based approaches is a really important area of saying, here's the kinds of things that we're looking to get out of this role. Out of this kind of work. But what are some other tactics that we could think about here in terms of like, it's like scope creep for job descriptions, right? Like, okay, you want me to do everything. but let's make it more specific. And then like, I guess, 'cause I'm thinking about this too, in terms of like, what are like, I'm imagining a business leader being like, I love this idea, but I don't know how to ask legally or ethically, how do I help you psychologically do the work that you need to do without like coming across as either condescending or like being out of touch, right? Like, like, hey, do you have ADHD? How can I help you work better? Like, how do you kind of coach them to kind of get around this what might feel like a social landmine of kind of getting to the heart of like what they have to do?
There are several questions in this one. And I don't want people to ask others if they have ADHD or autism or dyslexia or anything like that, unless people decide to disclose and feel safe enough. But we can always ask without any kind of medicalized language. And we can ask that of everybody, what do you need to do your best work? And it should be normalized. It shouldn't be a special thing for special situations. Why not think about it from the perspective, how do we enable our workforce to be on their best? It doesn't matter who you are or whether or not you have a particular diagnostic label. Maybe you don't know that you should have this label because you're from a generation when those labels were not common. And we can just normalize asking, how do you work best? And actually, that's what some of the leading companies in this space do. They just give people a little questionnaire. So how do you work best? How do you communicate best? How do you prefer feedback immediately afterwards with break in the weekend for you to think about if you're upset? And that's literally what one of the company's alternauts does. And yes, they are designed to work for neurodivergent people. They're majority autistic, but it would work for anyone. People are all different, and normalizing those differences and allowing everyone to say, this is how I work best, this is how I produce best, and at least allow us to experiment. I'll say, okay, if you think you need to work from home, and that hasn't been a policy of our company, let's try it. If you produce, what's the problem? And just being open to allowing people to do different things to discover who they are, because sometimes people think they need something they don't know. Sometimes they do, and they will tell you, and that's all you need to do is listen to them. Sometimes if someone is still discovering, maybe experiment a little bit, not necessarily making something permanent, but saying, let's try this week this thing and next week another thing. So you can help people find how they work best. And in general, you don't need to go into particular diagnosis, which is why those flexible environments really work for everyone, because people all have preferences. So if you think about autistic people, specifically, some things are so intense that they are necessary requirements. So someone absolutely cannot work when they're sneezing. So for example, my brain is going to shut down and in 3 minutes I'm going to start crying. I cannot work in an environment with extra noise. But for someone else, it could be a little bit less extreme. They're not going to start crying in 3 minutes, but they still have certain preferences. So everyone has those differences. They're just more intense for neurodivergent people, but everyone is going to appreciate being asked how they work best. And so that is how people can be more flexible, which is why in the Canary Code, the very first principle is participation. Don't assume that you know what someone else needs, either based on your amazing powers of, leadership, because nobody has those powers, or on the basis of the label. Because again, one autistic person or no one ADHD or one person who is dyslexic can be very different from another one. Someone can have all of the above and some other things that you need to consider. We all have very different situations. And even working from home, as much as I love working from home, there are people who live with 6 noisy roommates. So for some of them, going to the office is a very welcomed, quiet relief. So I can't even say that all autistic people need work from home as an accommodation, because yes, for some people it's ideal and for other people it's not. And again, you can't assume that autistic people don't want to do client-facing work, because some of us can actually really, really enjoy it. We need a little longer nap after that, but we can still enjoy that kind of work. So don't ever just say, okay, I know everything because I read this one article about how to manage XYZ people, that you have all the answers. Just getting to know people and normalizing this participation and normalizing difference can really get you a long way into creating better work environments. And no, you do not have to play a therapist or get into diagnosing people. That's not necessary. We all have differences. You just be attuned to differences, and we don't need to label them.
I was asking before about like how do you kind of get to this point of seeing what people need without asking directly, like, do you have the same? Because I've heard organizations get stuck at that question because they're like, well, I can't ask the diversity question. It's like, I think to your point, it's like you don't have to ask the diversity question. You have to ask the human question, because that's something that we all share in this case. And it's like the idea here, I guess participation I think is a fundamentally important part of that too, because it's like by being a part of that culture, again, by co-creating it, right? And by saying like, what do you need to thrive? And recognizing that can be a physical environment. It can be a social scenario setup. It can be the way that we do activities, we do feedback, right? And that again, it's not just something that if I'm a business leader, give to my employees, but it's how we do it together, right? And how we set up the parameters through which somebody can work. I think it's such an important thing to recognize too, right? So it's like, it's funny on the one hand too, because it's like, it's complex because we have to work through like organizational bureaucracy and cultural norms that like tell us not to think about these things, right? Until then we have to legally, which is not a great way to approach anything. But just like, on the one hand, it's nice that like we're seeing legal norms and policy now push saying we need to think more inclusively about how we run businesses in society. But also, as you're pointing out here too, is that a lot of this is like if we participate with one another and work on a human level, and like thriving can take place, in the workplace, and obviously many, many places as part of that too, which I think is super important, So as we kind of wrap our thinking here, I'm kind of curious as we think about like how you can envision the future of work, right? So, and maybe pulling from some other kind of principles we see in the Canary Code could be a way to think about this. But just like as you're working with organizations, but like a little bit like what you're hopeful for, like what could that future look like as we see organizations more increasingly prioritize like neuro inclusion and more intersectional belonging?
If we just focus on what people do best and what people enjoy and not limit hiring, we will end up with organizations where we don't have to argue, okay, everybody hates doing X. We need to force someone to do X, whatever it is, filing or organizing events or whatever it is.
Yeah.
If everyone hates something, what usually means your workforce is too homogeneous. You need to hire people that are representative of neurodiversity and different talents, just like, the world needs biodiversity for something to be healthy and not stagnant. So hire people from a full range of human population, because then you won't have to force someone into something that's not intrinsically motivating and they hate it. And then match people to what they do best. People, if you hire introverts and extroverts, you're going to have people who love being in front of others and get social energy. And you're going to have people who are going to enjoy those quiet tasks and long stretches of, writing or creating something or inventing something. And then you don't have to force people into doing things that they don't enjoy. Create jobs for real humans, who are good at some things and not so good at others, and align those jobs with the actual human strength. And then you're going to align, you think about the productivity. If you work with their best strength for 80% of the time, versus we work with our strengths for 10% of the time and then we do random stuff that gets thrown at us. If you think about cumulative productivity of organization, how much higher it's going to be. And it doesn't even have to be confined just to white-collar jobs or very special organizations. I talk about Lemon Tree, an incredible example of Indian hotel chain. They design jobs that are specific to a cluster of abilities. So they divided the job of a restaurant steward into two. The more social one, interacting with clients, upselling them on things, and another one where it's setting tables and preparing buffets and just making sure things are in the right place. And that's how they create a bunch of jobs for people with Down syndrome, because many of them align with the second part of the job. And then other stewards are happier because they don't have to do it as step, because people usually like one thing or the other. It's very hard to find a person who likes both. So it doesn't make sense. So they separated it and created jobs for actual humans. And then they have adjustability even within those. But then they also created other jobs within coffee shops and working on hotel rooms that also they hire people with Down syndrome and all the other people that are usually marginalized in society. And they are a thriving business. They do really well. Their workforce, even though they hire people who other people won't even consider, their workforce is incredible. They do wonderful jobs. So if we start thinking about creating jobs for actual humans and allowing those humans to work with their best strengths, I think that is going to be the future of work that many of us will be able to get behind. And again, hiring the full range of diversity, and specifically neurodiversity, and people with a full range of abilities, so that we have people matching all the different parts of potential job descriptions and doing what we're best at.
That future sounds great to me. You know, I love that. Lemon Tree is a great example too, where it's like, why not rethink what roles are, right? Like, and it's a great point. You know, I think there's this point. Like, I love what you said before in terms of that. If it seems like everybody hates a certain kind of work, it's because you're hiring the same kind of person, you know, over and over again. And so it's like, it's not that everybody hates email necessarily. It's that this kind of person hates email, right? You know, this like the kind of person that you keep hiring for X, Y, Z reason. You know, it's a really interesting point for us to recognize. Like, oh, it turns out, what's the common denominator? Me. I keep hiring them.
Yep.
You know, and part of that, you know, so it's like why it's so good to kind of open up that space. If you have a minute, I'd like just kind of one last kind of question here is that if folks, you know, both, I'm super excited for them to check out the book. Because again, you have a ton of great examples of organizations doing really cool work like this, like Lemon Tree. And like, you know, practical steps and worksheets and things for folks to kind of work through. As part of that, like if there's, I mean, I'm thinking like particularly of employees here, folks that they're in their organizations already and they're trying to like find out, how do I begin to advocate for more neuro inclusion in our workplace? Like, if I don't have all the power, like, you know, I guess what are some kind of practical steps or things that folks can do if they want to say, okay, I'm on board, like I'm gonna get the book, but then also like, what can I do now to kind of either talk to my boss or my managers or my colleagues about making our workplace more neuro-inclusive?
I actually talk about it. The concluding chapter is about how we can all work from our different positions, our own circles of influence, even if they're small, and still make a difference. And you don't even have to, you know, sneak my book to your boss, but you can just do a very little thing. You can just, at the end of every meeting, say, did everyone have an opportunity to express themselves? Should we open email after that to additional input? Or should we give everyone an opportunity to say something? And that's just kind of inclusion for quieter people that you can, if you do it consistently and then other people will likely start supporting you. You can create a new cultural norm. You can create a new cultural norm just by sharing an article that, you know, being on Zoom and always keeping your video on is actually not great for concentration and ability to follow. So it's not horrible if people have social anxiety, ADHD, or are just not feeling great that day turn off their video. It does not mean they're slacking off or doing whatever. So let's, trust our people to participate in a way that suits them. So there are many small things that people can do, and just sometimes just ask questions. So why are we doing it this way? Why is all of our training videos and not transcripts? Or why is it all reading and no videos? Sometimes just asking those questions can have a difference. And then people can do a lot more. If you're feeling braver, you can create an employee resource group. You can start working with other people, maybe on changing those cultural norms. You can suggest, can we have a speaker for this particular topic? And just reminding people whenever someone says, okay, let's work on our next hire, and you just remind them that how strong their handshake is and how much eye contact they make may not necessarily have a bearing on how an accountant is going to perform. So should we consider what exactly is necessary in that position? So it could be grand gestures, but it doesn't have to be grand gestures. It could be small impact every day. And then self-disclosure, if you feel safe enough, people who are in leadership positions and self-disclose can also encourage others to feel safer to self-disclose. And more of the active advocacy, again, you have to be ready. You don't necessarily have to do something that is going to threaten our livelihood if we think our organization is super unsafe. But we can still do little things, and then we can grow and become more confident, and we might end up making more of an impact. But it really depends on where you are. If you are in HR, you can really start asking questions about how we train, how we do onboarding, how do we promote. But you don't have to be in that kind of position. You can be in a very entry-level position and just start asking the right inclusive questions. Have you included everyone into the meeting planning or into event planning? Is this event going to be inclusive of people with sensory sensitivity? So just getting others to think about it could be a huge contribution.
Yes, exactly right. Also sneak the book to the boss, because sometimes they say, oh, I'm not sure. Here's your checklist. It was head up top, right? Sometimes the boss just wants that checklist. But I think this is a great point too, and I appreciate you sharing that, because it's like recognizing that even the small actions can ultimately have a big difference, right? Because it can empower yourself and empower others to say, oh, yeah, I loved that Ludmila asked that question in the meeting. I want to ask it this time to make sure everybody got to speak, right? Or got to kind of put out what they needed to. So I think that's great. Awesome. So Ludmila Praslova, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. It's been really great to talk with you. I'm excited for folks to check out the book. I'll have a link for it in the show notes as part of the episode, but and to your website and all the good stuff like that. So thank you for putting this out in the world, and let's go change it.
Thank you, Adam. Let's change it. Let's make it better.